You're listening to Soundside. I'm Kevin Kniestead, and here in Seattle, I don't need to tell you, we love our orcas. And maybe they love us back. Maybe. Here's KUOW's Gabriel Spitzer with more.
New research published in the Journal of Comparative Psychology documents multiple cases of wild orcas across different oceans apparently trying to share their prey with humans. Well, Jared Tower's here to explain what is going on. He's the executive director of Bay Cetology, which is a team of marine biologists based in Alert Bay, British Columbia. He's one of the authors on this study. Jared, welcome and thanks for joining us.
Yeah, happy to be here. Thanks for having me, Gabe.
So, okay, before we get too deep into the research here, I'm just so curious what this looks like what the scene of an orca sharing food with a human being actually looks like. Now, I understand that a couple of these encounters actually happened to you. Is that right? Can you give us the blow by blow?
I can. That is correct. They look basically like how you would think they would look, in the sense that a killer whale swims up and drops food right in front of you, if you can believe it. But that's what happened to me on two occasions. I spend probably almost 100 days a year with orcas, doing research on their behavior and abundance and all kinds of things. And so these cases don't happen very often, but when they do happen, the way that you perceive these animals changes. And sometimes killer whales will swim by with food, and it looks like they're trying to show it to you. But in these cases, they're a bit different in the sense that those killer whales will approach with food, but then stop and let the food go directly in front of you. And so that was a criteria for inclusion in the paper, was that killer whales had to approach people, and there had to be documentation of this, and then actually let go of whatever they were carrying, and they had to do so within their own body length to people.
Oh, wow. And so, okay, what happens after that? Did they drop it and then just go on their merry way, or did they stay there and watch to see what you did with it?
Well, in 97% of cases, they stopped and waited and watched to see how people would react. And most of the time, people didn't react at all. And and so in those cases, the orcas would pick up the food and leave. Sometimes they'd share it with other killer whales. Sometimes they'd pick it back up and just eat it by themselves. And in some cases, they'd pick it back up and then re-offer it again, almost like, no, this is for you, take it. And so those different things happened in the cases that we reviewed.
That is so wild. What did you do when an orca offered you its prey?
Well, the first time, I didn't actually realize it was happening. It was quite rough. And what had happened is that the whales were killing ancient murrelets, which is a small seabird, for fun. And and so I picked up one of these birds just to inspect it, get a confirmation on the species, and I tossed it back. And the killer whales were about 30 yards away or so. And two of them came right back over towards the boat, and one of them started mouthing this bird that I had just tossed back. I happened to have an underwater camera in the water next to the boat, and the other orca came up between the camera and the other whale and opened its mouth about perhaps 12 inches maximum from the camera and let out another bird that was packing in its mouth that was dead. And it just sat there with his bird in front of the lens, watching to wait and see what would happen. And after about 5 seconds or so, it picked the bird back up and swam away. And that camera was only a few feet below me. I was right next to the side of the boat when that happened. The other case was a few years later, and a single killer whale just swam directly up to the boat with a freshly killed harbor seal pup in its mouth and dropped it right in front of where my colleagues and I were standing, about 6 feet underneath us. Well, not even that. It was less than a couple feet underneath where we were standing. And the water was flat, calm, and we could see the harbor seal just slowly sinking as the whale swam a slow circle around the boat over about 15 or 20 seconds, and then picked the seal back up again, swam away, and started eating it.
Wow. Well, as I understand it, it is remarkable and rare, but not unheard of, right? You have I wound up documenting dozens of these encounters over multiple decades in different locations. So, this is clearly a pattern. Do we have any sense of why they're doing it?
Yeah, definitely. That was the point of the analysis, was after some time finding out about other cases that were happening in Mexico, New Zealand, and Argentina, and Norway, and now we even have more cases, one from Spain, one from Antarctica. Naturally, I wanted to be able to explain what was happening. I am a lifelong killer whale researcher, and this is one of those things that I just had no idea what was going on. So naturally, diving into the reciprocity literature and psychology literature, started to get a sense of what might be going on. And so there's both underlying mechanisms and proximate causes which facilitate this kind of behavior.
So let's go through a few of those. Let's start with the underlying mechanisms. What do we think is the deep motivation here?
Well, a couple things. First, killer whales often kill very large prey, just like our ancestors. We would go out and kill a mammoth or a bison or something, and that food would be distributed widely. But it has a curve of diminishing returns, or well, a better way to put it is that the value of that food declines over time. And for killer whales, they don't have a way to preserve food, transport food for long periods of time. And so all this extra food that they often have becomes much less valuable after it's killed and after they've consumed some. So I think that really sets them up to use prey in a variety of different ways, from just discarding it to interacting with other species which might want to feed on it as well. And in this case, using it to explore the behavior of a completely different creature, Homo sapiens. The other thing that really facilitates this behavior in the sense that it may underlie the ability for this behavior to actually take place or evolve in the first place is that killer whales are well-known prey sharers. There's not a whole lot of animals that share prey as well as they do, other than perhaps people and a few other species of mammal. But
You mean they share prey with one another, right? With other orcas?
that's correct. Yeah, that's the conspecific prey sharing indeed. And prey sharing is very common amongst related family members, throughout the animal kingdom. Birds feed their chicks and, mammals provide food for their offspring and whatnot. But killer whales do this throughout their entire lives. They're sharing with close kin and unrelated whales from the moment they're born. They're being offered food till they're old in age. They're providing food for their family members and getting provisioned by their family members. And and so I think all that sharing, all that reciprocity, it really, prey can be used in a variety of different ways to improve relationships and form relationships that have different meaning, whether it's bonding with family members or perhaps even finding a mate. And so I think prey-based reciprocity is something that's been going on in killer whale societies for thousands, if not millions of years already at this point. And so that really sets them up for this kind of behavior to be habitual in the first place. And then it can be used in ways that are proximate and may not benefit their fitness. And so those kinds of things are things like exploration, the ability to form relationships and explore opportunities in their environment, and generally just perhaps even practicing pro-social behavior.
Pro-social with another species. I mean, wow. Like,
Yeah.
do they have they ever been documented trying to share their prey with anything else, like an elk or something?
Well, no, they haven't. And it is interesting to think about, though, in the sense that these whales may actually be prey sharing with other species. Some populations of killer whale travel quite frequently with dolphins or other species of whale, and whether or not there's any kind of depredation or parasitism or just flat out prey sharing going on between these species, we don't know. Of course, there's other populations of killer whale that actually kill dolphins and whales, but several fish-eating populations just travel freely with things like fin whales or Pacific white-sided dolphins. and it's not in a predator-prey type relationship.
Oh, I see. Okay. So the behaviors that you're describing sound kind of familiar to me as a cat owner because I have seen more than a few headless rodents and birds and stuff turn up on my front porch thanks to my cat for, I can't quite tell what's in the cat's head. Does this seem like an analogous behavior?
Well, it may be, but it may not be. The main difference here is that your cat is domesticated and that these killer whales are wild. So that's probably the main distinction, whereas your cat may be engaged in reciprocity with you already. In this case, it's a wild animal instigating reciprocity with a human. And so far as we know, that's almost unheard of in the animal kingdom. Like humans are famous for going out and experimenting with the behavior of other living creatures. We try to feed the birds, and we're trying to domesticate other animals all the time or tame them. But in this case, it's the killer whales that are trying to feed us while we're in their environment, indicating that we may be more alike with them than we previously realized.
Do we think they're trying to tame us?
I have no idea. We may not be that wild to begin with, so it may just be that they're trying to get a sense of who we are by gauging our responses.
I am curious if this has changed the way that you see the relationship between our two species, between orcas and human beings.
Yes and no. Yeah. Most of the encounters I have with orcas is par for the course. They don't really appreciate the boat being near them too much, and but occasionally they'll get curious and come over and check you out. So it kind of depends on what mood they're in. I think it did change my perspective on what they're capable of after these two encounters happened to me where they tried to offer me food. Um, but it's in some ways not surprising that they've occasionally engaged in this behavior, just given the fact that they have, such large brains. They're so evolved in that regard, and they're very social animals, which have the capacity to engage in novel behaviors and adapt to different things in their environment and very quickly.
Yeah. And all those things, of course, made them a real object of fascination among humans, of mythology, of all kinds of things. And I'm just curious if a lot of folks are seeing this as something like altruism and how you feel about that.
I feel pretty good about it. I think that killer whales are altruistic. I mean, it would be strange to think that they didn't have emotions of any kind or didn't have the capacity to be altruistic. But I think we need to keep in mind that killer whales often behave without regard for humans. And they do this in different places around the world where they steal fish from fishermen or they play with sailboats until the sailboats break. And and so in some cases, killer whales may be trying to offer us food. It definitely looks and seems and feels pro-social, but it could be Machiavellian. These killer whales are very smart and they're always looking for ways to benefit themselves, just like any other creature is. So, an example of this comes from captivity, where killer whales are naturally being fed by their trainers, and sometimes they'll use that food to bait a heron, which is a bird and there's lots of these birds in places like SeaWorld, and they just walk around the edges of the tank. And so sometimes killer whales will offer a little bit of fish to one of these birds, and then the bird will reach out and grab it, and then the killer whale will reach out and grab the bird and kill it. And just for fun, just because it's entertaining. And so, I should say that by also mentioning that killer whales have never killed anybody in the wild.
So we don't think they were trying to bait you and eat you.
I didn't get that impression, but exploratory behavior could result in a variety of different actions if it gets repeated.
Yeah. Well, this is an interesting time. It seems like for this publication to come out, it's come out among some other recent orca discoveries, including the idea that they can sometimes make tools out of kelp to groom each other in cooperative ways. That's really fascinating. And it just seems like a pretty exciting time in the field, all the while these whales are facing threats to their very existence and survival. So I'm just curious what's it like being an orca researcher at a time like this?
Well, it's very interesting, and I think it applies to different fields as well. But like anthropology or ornithology, there's new discoveries being made all the time. But the same is certainly true in the field of cetology. And if you're as interested in killer whales as much as I am, it's really exciting. Drones in particular have really facilitated greater understanding of their behaviors because you just can't really see orcas. Really, but if you have a drone up and the water's calm, you get a much deeper appreciation for how they're actually living their lives. And you can do that without being close to them, which is really nice. So yeah, it's definitely an interesting time, and there's lots more findings coming down the pipe for sure because there are people engaged in killer whale research in countries all around the world at this point.
And your remark about distance reminds me that, if people are hoping to get offered some orca prey, they need to remember that Washington state law says orca watchers have to stay 1,000 yards away from these animals. So do not approach them. Don't ask them for dead harbor seal or anything like that. But I wanted to end this conversation with this. You talked to CNN about this research, and you said, quote, "While our species is obviously more technologically advanced than any other on the planet, we do share it with other highly evolved species whose welfare must be considered in our actions." Can you just tell me a little bit more about what you meant by that?
Well, I think first off, if killer whales had opposable thumbs, we'd be in trouble, but they don't. So, they haven't been able to fashion things out of their environment in the ways that we do. And that really sets us apart from any other species on the planet. And I think that because of that, we often see ourselves as very dominant, and we are, but we often see ourselves as almost separate from the natural world. And at this point, I think it's safe to say that we are, but we're still an animal. We still evolved over millions of years, just like these other creatures. And we often have a separatist approach to understanding them, where we don't want to anthropomorphize and think of animals with human attributes. But I'm not sure we can really conserve these animals without doing that to some extent safely. But we have to realize that these are creatures with emotions. In some cases, many different species, including killer whales, as this study implies, have theory of mind, meaning that they have the ability to realize that other creatures have their own perspectives of things. And we don't think of any other species on the planet as having that capacity other than ourselves. But it's simply not true. So I think we just need to be better neighbors with these animals. They don't belong to us. They're their own nations. And we need to start realizing that when we interact with them and live alongside them.
Jared Towers is the executive director of Bay Cetology. He was here to tell us about how orcas appear to be feeding humans, or at least trying. Jared, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thanks for listening to Soundside. By the way, this show is only possible because listeners support us. If you are able to give right now, check out the show notes for a link to donate. And don't forget, you can listen live on KUOW 94.9 FM Seattle at noon and 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, or anytime online at KUOW.org.